So you read the title. Why did World War I start? We've all heard the same agreed upon story about the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, setting off a chain reaction because of the tensions and complex systems of alliances in Europe. More educated historians might be able to give a more nuanced view that delves into lesser known details, and they may even touch on some of the theories that I'm going to present in this video. Others, that we would call intellectual elites, will scoff at the ideas in this video and say that unless you have 20 years of background of studying World War I and at least 10 published papers, you shouldn't dare to comment publicly on what may or may not have happened in this dreadful time period. But you feel it too, don't you? The word from on high is becoming less and less convincing, and we're entering an age where it makes a lot less sense to blindly trust authority and accept the prescribed historical narrative. The techniques that are being used to inculcate today's population with the agreed upon historical stories are similar to the techniques used to escalate the war to begin with, producing the dreadful consequences that we stand silent in remembrance of every year. To set the tone for this video, I'll start with an excerpt from one of Rudolf Steiner's lectures on this very topic, given in 1917, about a year before the Great War ended. It is interesting to note that in 1910, someone wrote that large-scale capitalism had succeeded in making democracy into the most marvelous, flexible, and effective tool for exploiting the whole population. Financiers were usually imagined to be the enemies of democracy, the individual concerned wrote, but this was a fundamental error. On the contrary, they run democracy and encourage it, for it provides a screen behind which they can hide their method of exploitation, and they find it their best defense against any objections which the populace may raise. For once, therefore, a man woke up and saw that what mattered was not to proclaim democracy, but to see the full reality, not to follow slogans, but to see things as they are. This would be particularly important today, for people would then realize that the events which reign with such blood and terror over the whole of humanity are guided and directed from just a few centers. People will never realize this if they persist in the delusion that nation is fighting nation, and allow the European and American press to lull them to sleep over the kinds of relations that are said to exist between nations. Everything said about antagonism and opposition between nations only exists to cast a veil over the true reasons. For we shall never arrive at the real truth if we feed on words in order to explain these events, but only if we point to actual people. The problem is that this tends to be unpalatable today, and the man who woke up and wrote these statements in 1910 also presented some highly unwelcome accounts in his book. He produced a list of 55 individuals who were the real rulers and exploiters of France. The list can be found in Francis de Lazy's La Démocratie et les Financiers, written in 1910. The same man has also written La Guerre qui vient, a book which has become famous. In his La Démocratie et les Financiers, you will find statements of fundamental significance. There you have someone who has woken up to reality. Francis de Lazy for sure may have woken up to reality, but nowadays, he'd be brandished with the name conspiracy theorist, meant of course in a derogatory way, intended to devalue his well-studied theories as those of a gullible fool at best, or a dangerous madman at worst. If you're someone who's attempted to wake up to reality in the past few years or decades, you've probably had the experience of being seen as a gullible fool, and maybe at times it was for good reason. Maybe you were wrong about something, or you believed something without sufficient evidence, and it turned out not to be true. The way I see it, that's completely fine, because as long as you keep earnestly searching for the truth with a pure heart and a constantly open mind, you'll definitely find the right paths to it, no matter how many wrong turns you take. Stepping out of the comfort zone of established narratives in this way is much braver, and in the long term, much more beneficial than parroting supposed authority figures. In the end, you might find that some of these figures were completely right in some ways, but at least you would have confirmed that for yourself as an individual. I'll continue with an excerpt from a book written by two other such conspiracy madmen, The book is called Killing the Planet by Rodney Howard Brown and Paul L. Williams, and it's filled to the brim with references for its information, allowing you to branch off into your own investigations, so I highly recommend this one. World War I, like all wars, was caused by economic interests, and plans for the global conflict were underway decades before the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The creation of the German Empire under Bismarck had upset the balance of powers that existed in Europe for more than 2 centuries. England ruled supreme over the continent until 1871. This supremacy had been repeatedly challenged by Spain and by France, but England always remained victorious. Because Germany grew increasingly stronger by acquiring colonies in Africa and by building up its military force, it became a severe threat to the economic hegemony of England. The threat was intensified when the German government obtained a concession from Sultan Abdul Hamid to drill the Baghdad-Mosul oil fields and to build a Baghdad to Berlin railroad in 1904. At that time, the international bankers, who were excluded from the economic development in Germany, sought for ways to limit and control Germany. Between 1894 and 1907, a number of international treaties were signed to have Russia, France, England, and other nations unite against Germany in the case of war. It was the task of the so-called Committee of 300 of the British Pilgrim Society to set the stage for World War. Members of the committee included Lord Albert Grey, Lord Arnold Toynbee, Lord Alfred Milner, and H.J. Mackinder, who became known as the father of geopolitics. Edward Bernays, the so-called father of public relations, and Walter Lippmann, the founding father of the New Republic, were the American specialists of the committee. Lord Rothermere, aka Harold Harmsworth, used his newspaper, the Daily Mail, as a tool to try out their social conditioning techniques on its readers. After a test period of 6 months, they had found that 87% of the public had formed opinions without rational or critical thought processes. Thereupon, the English working class became subjected to a constant onslaught of propaganda designed to convince them that they were obliged to send their sons by the millions to their deaths. The experiment verified that human beings can be conditioned as easily as rats. There's plenty more context to be delved into there, but according to these writers, the international bankers got exactly what they wanted when the war started. The problem was that by 1915, Germany were winning the war, and that definitely wouldn't have been the favoured outcome. So something had to be done about it. Continuing. An incident had to be manufactured that would provoke the American people to abandon their stance of isolationism and to enter the fracas. It came with the sinking of the Lusitania by a German submarine on May 7th, 1915. When the ship went down, 1,198 civilians, including 128 Americans, died, and the seemingly unprovoked act of aggression against a passenger ocean liner served to arouse anti-German sentiment throughout the country. Many of the 767 survivors popped up and down in the waves for 3 hours while seagulls swooped from the sky to peck out the eyes of the floating corpses. Few Americans realized that the sinking and delayed rescue had been planned by Winston Churchill, and that members of the British Admiralty were acting in tandem with Britain's Board of Trade, including Colonel Edward M. House of the Wilson administration and American industrialists, along with J.P. Morgan, who had provided massive loans to Great Britain and the Allied forces. The American public was not informed that Lusitania was transporting 6 million rounds of ammunition and other military munitions to Britain. Upon the order of President Wilson, the ship's original manifest was hidden away in the archives of the Treasury Department. Nor were they made aware that Churchill and other memories of the Admiralty had directed the Lusitania to proceed at a considerably reduced speed and without escort to the precise location within the Irish Sea where the German U-boat was lying in wait. And the public, for the most part, remained oblivious that the Germans had placed large ads in the New York newspapers to dissuade Americans from boarding the ocean liner. Well, that's certainly a bit odd, and it's far from the only theory out there. You may have heard of another that points to the influence of Zionism in the whole affair, which is supposedly one of the catalysts for the retribution against the Jewish people, less than 3 decades later during World War II. The following is an excerpt from a book by Robert Sepehr, a brilliant anthropologist with plenty of videos here on YouTube. In 1917, Chaim Weizmann became president of the British Zionist Federation. He worked with the United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary, Arthur James Balfour, to obtain the milestone Balfour Declaration, which stated in writing that in exchange for bringing America into the war against Germany, the British would give Palestine to the Rothschild Zionists. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object. The press published this letter 1 week later, and the Balfour Declaration was later incorporated into the peace treaty with the Ottoman Empire and the mandate for Palestine. The original document is kept at the British Library. The reason that America entered World War I, directly leading to the defeat and destruction of Germany, was due to a formal agreement between Britain and Mr. Rothschild, which promised Palestine as a new Jewish homeland in exchange for America's entry into the war. In this book, Robert includes a quote from Benjamin Friedman, who in 1961 made this very claim. You can watch the full speech on YouTube.
It's absolutely absurd that Great Britain, that never had any connection or any interest or any right in what is known as Palestine, should offer it as coin of the realm to pay the Zionists for bringing the United States into the war. However, they made that promise in October of 1916. October 1916. And shortly after that, I don't know how many here remember it, the United States, which was almost totally pro-German, because the newspapers here were controlled by Jews, the bankers were Jews, all the media of mass communications in this country were controlled by Jews, and they were pro-German, because their people, in a majority of cases, came from Germany, and they wanted to see Germany lick the Tsar. At that time, everything changed, like the traffic light that changes from red to green, where the newspapers had been all pro-German, where they'd been telling the people the difficulties that Germany was having fighting Great Britain commercially and in other respects. All of a sudden, the Germans were no good. They were villains. They were Huns. They were shooting Red Cross nurses. They were cutting off babies' hands, and they were no good. Well, shortly after that, Mr. Wilson declared war on Germany.
So, was it the Rockefellers or the Rothschilds or both or neither? I don't know. I'm simply presenting alternative perspectives that you can continue to investigate in your own time. All I can say for sure is 1. The names Rockefeller and Rothschild seem to pop up a lot when studying humanity's worst events in the past couple of centuries, and 2. The general population hasn't been given the full story about World War I. Now let's rise up slowly from the purely earthly affairs and start getting into the one solution humanity has when faced with the times we're living in. This is an excerpt from another Rudolf Steiner lecture titled Signs of the Times, East, West, Central Europe, given on 30th of April 1918. Not only does the human body need a soul, but everybody needs a soul and cannot live without one. What is spread across the earth as a physical body in commercial, industrial, or other ways needs a soul that offers the possibility that people on earth understand each other spiritually as they understand each other commercially and monetarily. But this has been neglected until now, and in this present catastrophic time, we are experiencing it in the most terrible way, as has never happened before in the history of the development of humanity, which can be traced with the documents. That humanity finds itself in a dead end, in a real dead end. And it will only escape from this deadlock if it decides to add to the physical culture of which humanity is so proud, the spiritual culture of the earth's soul for our time and for the near future, which belongs to the physical culture. One may resist these efforts to give the earth a new spirituality as much as one wants, but the truth will have to prevail under all circumstances. Humanity is now living in the midst of a terrible catastrophe. If humanity does not decide to truly adapt to the new spirituality meant here, then these catastrophes will keep recurring in ever new periods, perhaps in very short periods. This catastrophe and all of its consequences will never be healed by the means that humanity already knew before this catastrophe broke out. Anyone who still believes this is not thinking in terms of the earthly development of humanity. And this catastrophic time will last as long as it can be bridged, apparently, for a few years in between, until humanity interprets it in the only correct way, namely that it is a sign that people are turning to the spirit that must permeate purely physical life. Today this may still be a bitter truth for many because it is inconvenient, but it is a truth. Well, that's it for this video. You might not believe you have a soul, but this doesn't stop the people who have a lot of power in our society, either in the public eye or in complete secret, from using their knowledge of the spiritual world to influence you in ways that you can only scratch the surface of by studying modern disciplines like psychology or biology. In the meantime, what's the harm in acting like you do have a soul, learning about what a soul is even supposed to be, and trying to understand others on a soul level? Then you can see what comes of it. It's really up to you. As always, I'll finish with verses from the Bible. If you've made it this far, thanks for watching, and please consider subscribing for more content like this. Matthew chapter 24, verses 6 to 13. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many, and because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. And finally, Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 to 13. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand.